A semiglue, why nations fail. 5. I've seen the future, and it works. Growth under extractive institutions.
You know, it's fascinating to consider how much institutional differences really shape economic growth throughout history. The source makes a strong point that even extractive political and economic institutions, which have been common for most societies, can generate wealth. A powerful ruler with a centralized state can actually introduce law and order, set up rules, and stimulate economic activity to ensure there's something to extract.
The source makes a strong point that even extractive political and economic institutions, which have been common for most societies, can generate wealth. A powerful ruler with a centralized state can actually introduce law and order, set up rules, and stimulate economic activity to ensure there's something to extract.
Exactly, and that's where that famous quote, "I've seen the future and it works," comes in. It was Lincoln Steffens, a muckraker journalist, who said it after visiting Soviet Russia in 1919. He was sent on a mission to understand the Bolsheviks after the First World War. He was incredibly impressed seeing their plan as a revolutionary government with an evolutionary plan to address societal evils and create economic democracy first, then political democracy through a dictatorship.
It's striking how many Westerners, even up until the early 1980s, continued to believe the Soviet Union was working and seeing it as the future.
The source vividly illustrates how the Soviet Union achieved rapid economic growth, especially under Stalin. After Lenin died, Stalin consolidated power by 1927 and launched a rapid industrialization drive managed by the State Planning Committee, Gosplan. His method was straightforward: develop industry through government command and extract resources by heavily taxing agriculture. Since they lacked an effective tax system, he collectivized agriculture, abolishing private land ownership and forcing people into collective farms run by the Communist Party.
And the consequences of that collectivization were catastrophic for rural populations. Production plummeted because people lacked incentives to work hard, leading to widespread famine, where an estimated 6 million people died, with hundreds of thousands more murdered or exiled to Siberia. It sounds like a recipe for disaster, yet the Soviet Union still experienced rapid growth.
That's the key paradox the source explains. While markets are the best way to efficiently allocate resources, in specific instances like the Soviet Union's focus on heavy industry, a top-down extractive process can still generate growth. It was about reallocating poorly utilized labor from primitive agriculture to industry, where despite its own inefficiencies, it was more productive. They weren't creating growth through technological change, but through capital accumulation and this reallocation of labor.
So the growth was impressive for a time, growing at 6% a year between 1928 and 1960, which was an astonishing rate for its time. It even convinced the CIA and economists like Paul Samuelson, who repeatedly predicted Soviet economic dominance well into the 21st century.
Yes, but the source makes it clear this rapid growth wasn't sustained. By the 1970s, it had largely stopped. Extractive institutions, by their nature, cannot generate sustained technological change because of a lack of economic incentives and resistance from the elites. Once all the easily reallocated and efficiently used resources were moved to industry, the system hit a roadblock, lacking innovation and proper incentives for further progress. The only area they managed sustained innovation was in military and aerospace technology, leading to achievements like putting the first dog and man in space.
And what about Gosplan? I remember it was supposed to be the all-powerful planning agency.
This source reveals Gosplan's plans were often ignored, revised, or simply drafts. Stalin himself stated that plan creation was just the beginning. His true aim was to maximize his discretion to reward loyalists and punish enemies, and Gosplan's role was mainly to provide him with information. The incentive schemes were also problematic. Workers received bonuses for meeting output targets. However, this created disincentives for innovation as it risked missing current targets and led to ratcheting up, where exceeding targets meant higher targets in the future, so underachievement was often the best strategy. Even when incentives changed behavior, they created other issues like producing steel sheets that were too heavy or too thin, or chandeliers too heavy to hang, illustrating the failure of central planning to replace the market's invisible hand.
It sounds like a system rife with perverse incentives, and they even resorted to extreme coercion.
Absolutely. Beyond carrots like bonuses, the Communist Party used big sticks. Laws made absenteeism and even idling criminal offenses, punishable by hard labor or pay cuts. Between 1940 and 1955, 36 million people, about a third of the adult population, were found guilty of such offenses, with 15 million imprisoned and 250,000 shot. But even this didn't work for innovation, as you can't force people to think and have good ideas under threat of death. The core issue was that introducing truly effective incentives would have required abandoning extractive institutions, which would have jeopardized the Communist Party's political power, as seen when Gorbachev started moving away from them.
The source then shifts to another fascinating example with the Lele and Bashang peoples in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They live on opposite banks of the Kasai River, share common origins and languages, and even similar crafts. Yet in the 1950s, anthropologists found the Lele were poor, producing for subsistence with inferior technology and constant conflict, while the Bashang were rich, producing for exchange, using sophisticated mixed farming, and enjoying law and order.
This disparity wasn't due to geography, ignorance, or a cultural aversion to technology. Instead, the differences stemmed from their political institutions. Around 1620, the Bashang experienced a political revolution led by King Siam, who forged the Kuba Kingdom. He built a centralized state with a bureaucracy, legal system, and police force, establishing law and order, albeit in an absolutist and extractive manner.
So Siam's political revolution led to an economic one.
Precisely. Agriculture was reorganized, new high-yield crops from the Americas like maize and cassava were adopted, and an intensive mixed farming cycle doubled per capita food production. The age of marriage was even lowered to 20 to bring more men into the agricultural labor force, contrasting sharply with the Lele, whose men married at 35 and often dedicated their earlier lives to fighting. Siam and his elites wanted to extract taxes and wealth, and thus encouraged economic activity.
So, like the Soviet Union, it was growth generated by command under extractive institutions.
Yes, and it led to significant economic prosperity compared to the Lele. However, it was also limited. The source states there was no creative destruction or technological innovation after this initial change, a situation that remained largely unaltered until the Belgians arrived in the late 19th century. This highlights how some limited economic success can be achieved through extractive institutions if they create a centralized state to reorganize the economy and boost productivity, but it doesn't lead to sustained innovation.
The source then takes us even further back to the Neolithic Revolution. It suggests that the warming climate after the Ice Age, known as the Long Summer, created a critical juncture for human societies to transition to sedentary life, farming, and herding. This domestication of plants and animals was a significant technological change, allowing much more food production.
Indeed, the earliest evidence of farming and herding comes from the hilly flanks in the Middle East with the Natufian culture. What's crucial and what challenges traditional explanations like Jared Diamond's is that the Natufians were sedentary before they started domesticating plants or animals. Evidence like gazelle teeth suggest year-round residence at sites like Abu Huraira, where people were hunter-gatherers for 500 years before switching to agriculture.
So the shift to sedentary life came first, and it wasn't necessarily because of unique plant availability.
Correct. While becoming sedentary offered benefits like easier food storage and processing, it also brought challenges like conflict resolution, as people couldn't simply move away. This required more elaborate notions of property and institutions to make and enforce rules. The source argues it's plausible that hunter-gatherers had to be forced to settle down, preceded by an institutional innovation that concentrated power in the hands of a political elite. This elite would enforce property rights, maintain order, and, crucially, benefit by extracting resources.
So a political revolution, similar to King Siam's, but on a smaller scale, likely led to sedentary life and then farming.
That's the argument. The archaeological evidence from Natufian sites like Ain Malaha supports this, showing a complex society with hierarchy, order, and inequality, the beginnings of extractive institutions, long before they became farmers. Elaborate burials, control of trade in obsidian and shells, and evidence of skull cults and inherited elite status all point to this. These political elites likely drove the transition to sedentary life and then to farming, not necessarily because people wanted to work harder, but because the elites benefited from organizing society and extracting resources. The long summer provided the opportunity, but institutional differences determined where and when this transition occurred. The Maya city-states provide another compelling example of growth under extractive institutions, but also of its fundamental limit, political instability leading to collapse. They built a sophisticated civilization in southern Mexico and Central America, with distinct city-states, writing, and a sophisticated calendar. Their classic era, between AD 250 and 900, was a period of flourishing culture and civilization, but it ultimately collapsed.
What does the evidence tell us about this?
We have archaeological evidence like dated monuments, which peaked around the middle of the 8th century and then rapidly collapsed by the 9th and 10th centuries. King lists, such as those on Altar Q at Copan, show dynasties like Kinich Yax Kukmo ruling for centuries, but then abruptly ending. Population estimates using techniques like obsidian hydration show Copan's population soaring from 600 in AD 400 to 28,000 by AD 750 to 799, only to decline sharply afterward.
So the rise was dramatic, but so was the fall. What were the underlying institutions?
Similar to the Bushong, the Mayas' economic development was based on extractive institutions with state centralization. A ruling class emerged, with a divine lord, Kuhul Aja, at the top, supported by aristocrats. This system, though without popular participation, brought stability. The Kuhul Aja raised tribute from farmers and organized labor for monumental building projects. This created an impressive economic expansion, with occupational specialization in pottery, weaving, and extensive trade.
It sounds like a successful system for a long time.
For a time, yes, but after consolidation around AD 300, there was little further technological change. Agricultural technology remained rudimentary, and there was no creative destruction. Instead, the wealth generated by these extractive institutions for the Kuhul Aja and the elite led to constant warfare, which intensified over time. Inscriptions record these star wars between major states like Tikal and Calakmul, with subjugation of smaller states.
And this infighting ultimately led to the collapse?
The overwhelming fact is that the collapse coincided with the overthrow of the Kuhul Aja political model. Royal palaces were abandoned, monuments stopped being carved, and political and social institutions unraveled. The economy contracted and the population fell. While there was widespread violence in some regions, even in places like Copan, monuments were defaced or destroyed. The source suggests that intensified intercity warfare and internal opposition, possibly led by rival elite factions, ultimately overthrew the existing institutions. The extractive institutions, while generating wealth, also created immense inequality and the potential for infighting, leading to the undoing of Maya civilization.
The source concludes that extractive institutions are common because they can generate limited prosperity, distributing wealth to a small elite, but require political centralization to do so. The state or elite then has incentives to invest and encourage others to generate wealth for extraction. We saw this with the Caribbean plantation economies using slave labor for sugar, and the Soviet Union reallocating resources to industry. This potential for extractive growth is what drove King Xiama, the Natufians, and the Maya elites. But it's not sustainable.
Precisely. The core problem is that this type of growth is fundamentally different from growth under inclusive institutions. It is not sustainable. Extractive institutions do not foster creative destruction and only generate limited technological progress. The Soviet experience clearly shows this limit. Rapid catch-up growth fizzled out by the 1970s because incentives couldn't stimulate technological progress across the economy.
And the Maya example showed another critical flaw.
Yes, beyond the lack of innovation, the Maya city-states illustrate a more common and ominous end: political instability. When extractive institutions create significant gains for the elite, it creates strong incentives for others to fight to replace them. Infighting and instability are inherent features, causing inefficiencies and often reversing political centralization, even leading to a complete breakdown of law and order, as the Maya experienced. This demonstrates that while growth under extractive institutions can appear spectacular, like in the Soviet Union or modern-day China, it is inherently limited and unlikely to be sustained without fundamental political transformation.